Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Hollander. I am the director of a postdoctoral program called the Curriculum Fellows Program. This is a three-year postdoc program for folks that are interested in teaching heavy careers or in higher education administration. And I am so excited to be a part of this discussion as I myself had a non-academic postdoc, even though I am now back in academia. And so today I would love to introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Elizabeth Walker. She is in cell culture development at Thermo Fisher Scientific. We have Dr. Dane Samilo. He's a senior science policy analyst in the Department of Defense. And we have Dr. Jaspreet, a senior scientist at LysisLogic Scientific Inc. And so I'm going to have Dane start us off describing his career. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dane.
Okay, so the title of my talk is Nonlinear Career Signaling Pathways for Pleiotropic Non-Terminally Differentiated Job Seekers. I miss some of the science in my work today. So, and just some housekeeping for me. I have to put a disclaimer that the views expressed do not reflect those of my employer, CACI International, nor do they reflect those of the federal government or the Department of Defense. Some people know from an early age what they want to do, and there's a very clear track laid out for them. Say someone wants to become a physician, they'll do a pre-med. For undergrad, go to med school, complete the residency, maybe do a fellowship, and then finally go on to become an attending. Similarly, for a scientist, you might do research in a lab as an undergraduate, and then go to grad school, do a postdoc, and apply for professorial jobs, and then hopefully get tenure. That could not have been further from my experience. When I was younger, I wanted to do everything. I wanted to be a writer, a video game developer, a teacher, a web designer, an artist, a biologist, everything. But I wound up settling on majoring in biology and doing a minor in studio art for undergrad. And then I also did internships in geophysics, which is like seismology and that kind of thing, public health. And then I wound up working in a yeast genetics lab. And I loved all of them, but I still had to choose. And from there, I was torn between going into epidemiology or immunology. I even looked for programs that would allow me to do both a PhD and an MPH. But in the end, it was 2009 and the world was still reeling from the housing market crash of 2008. So I went for the PhD route, which is frequently paid for. So there was that recession. And then while I was in grad school, I did a lot. So I led journal clubs. I ran a martial arts club. I TA'd for a grant writing course. I did STEM outreach to K through 12 students. I led departmental committees. And probably most significantly for me, I co-founded a science policy organization. And it was through that I learned about science policy and the world of science policy, and I became interested in that as a career. I also, it kind of really became clear to me that I didn't fit the mold of what I imagined perhaps a scientist should be. And doing all of this, I burned myself out. I already knew I didn't want to do a postdoc, but I was not really in a mental state to apply for a policy fellowship. So in the meantime, I kind of dipped my toes into the medical writing world, which was fine, but not ultimately what I wanted to do in the long run. And then finally, I applied for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship and was placed in the Office of the Department of Defense, which focused on an office that focused on DoD laboratories and STEM education programs, which, by the way, I didn't know this before, but DoD funds is one of the largest funders of K through 12 STEM education programs from the federal government. And I should say that up to this point, while science policy was interesting to me, I knew that what, quote unquote, science policy is, it entails a lot. And this office really allowed me to try my hand at different kinds of things in the policy world. So program evaluation, program management, I could do interagency work, I could do congressional report writing, strategic planning, policy analysis, like you name it. And that probably all just sounds foreign, like gobbledygook to you, but once you get into that world, you'll realize just how many options are in front of you. And then this whole worldwide pandemic thing happened and upended my fellowship a bit too. I'm sure many of you who were doing research experienced the same thing. I was very fortunate to have a very supportive office, and in a rare turn of events, I was able to get a contractor position in the same office as my fellowship, which is admittedly not typical. And I've been there since 2021. But moving forward, I know for sure I don't want to stay in this position forever for a number of reasons I won't get into unless you ask in the Q&A. But I do want to shift my focus and my trajectory again, and I want to return more to that technical side that uses my background in biology, right? I kind of miss that, if you couldn't tell by the title. I want to try my hand more at like some communications work, say, and my pipe dream is actually to one day become a kids educational TV show runner. So this is me manifesting it by repeating it to enough people that I hold myself accountable and make it happen. But the short of it is, I didn't know what I wanted to do for a very large part of my life because my skill sets and my interests didn't overlap in a typical traditional career path. And clearly not everything was smooth sailing. But that hasn't stopped me from changing career paths. And I maintain that it's never too late to make a sudden left turn and pivot into something foreign and new. So transitioning back a little bit to what drew me to science policy in the first place, it essentially boils down to three kind of major pillars: impact, utility, and energy. So in terms of impact, when you're working at the bench, sometimes it's hard to see how far down the line, the impact of your research might have. I mean, I don't know, maybe you discover CRISPR and then it's going to be like this big thing. But for a lot of folks, I know that, we talk about the whole bench to bedside pipeline that can take a really long time. With policy, sometimes it's slow, right? Federal government is very slow, but you do see those impacts, sometimes immediately even. So it really just depends on what you work on, but it's very gratifying to see that impact. In terms of utility, so you're using your soft skills a lot here. And if you're someone who has a lot of those soft skills and likes using them, you do wind up combining that with your analytical skills and your communication skills to bring different perspectives to the government and decision making. And simultaneously, so many of you are probably data nerds too, and the federal government is sitting simultaneously on mountains of idle data sets that they're not doing anything with, but then it's also not collecting potentially critical data. And an example of this might be National Science Foundation. They just started collecting LGBTQ plus data on trainees, right? And that was just absent for a long time, and they're finally only now starting to implement that. And then energy, finally. People in policy are typically excited about their work, and they earnestly want to make a difference. The government is a double-edged sword. It can be used for both good and bad, and you'll see that in every agency, basically. But for the most part, the circles that I run in, everyone really wants to help our society. They want to make the world better. They want to use science and apply it in ways that help humanity. So that's something I really enjoy about the policy world. So whenever someone in science policy sits on a career panel and is asked, what's your typical day like? They usually give this very trite, like, there is no typical day response, but it's actually kind of true. You could be doing anything from organizing and presenting at meetings, facilitating roundtables and taking meeting minutes. You could be leading agency-wide, interagency task forces. You could be writing, reviewing, editing documents, all of those ones I listed there. You could be determining and setting metrics and goals for data collection. And then you could be doing that data collection yourself, doing analysis of that data, creating data visualizations, because you're communicating this to people who are not always necessarily data or science literate. So you need to find a way to kind of get those points across. You could be reviewing and interpreting legislation or executive orders. You could even be writing legislative proposals or responding to congressional or agency leadership inquiries. And sometimes, I even wind up playing AV or tech help for some of our less tech savvy colleagues. So it really runs the gamut. And in terms of, what a job could look like, it really varies. So there are 9 to 5s. My position is very 9 to 5. But then there are those folks who are on call round the clock, taking meetings with Japan at like 2 a.m. So it really just depends on the nature of your office's portfolio. Obviously world events, right? Like there were offices that were not doing that as much maybe, and then suddenly COVID-19 happens and they're just flooding with work. But it also, every office, every agency has sort of like a microcosm of its own culture. So that can also affect your lifestyle. But in summary, if you're a pleiotropic, non-terminally differentiated person like me who's interested in a career in science policy, or you just want to kind of dabble in the dark arts for a bit, I say embrace your pluripotency. Be open-minded because you never know where you may wind up. Be adaptable. Those world events, those crazy life changes, you can never know when they're going to arise. So, just be able to kind of roll with the punches. Try to prioritize compatibility with the lifestyle you want to lead, the people you resonate with, and the work you want to do, maybe even in that order. I don't know. And use process of elimination if you have to in order to figure out what you like or dislike. Document all the work you do because it's really important that you look at those transferable skills and see how they might work in different jobs where you're not an expert. And if you're interested in perhaps not an exhaustive list, but a very full listing of science policy fellowships, you can follow this link here. You can ask me, I can share it with you. And some of those fellowships are open to non-US citizens. Some of them are at the local, state level. Some are international. So I think Canada has their own. There are plenty of fellowship opportunities to help you transition into government. Just wanted to thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions. And you can find me on LinkedIn here or just by searching my name. I'm the only Dane Samilo. And just make sure to note if you reach out to me that it was through the ASM career panel or I might think it's spam. And then here's just a bonus slide of my fellowship cohort. And you can see all the lovely things we did, even, with the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dane. I really appreciate you describing how sometimes we just have to go with the flow with things that we can't control. And we will address the questions specifically that were asked during Dane's presentation at the end of all the presentations, but we appreciate you sharing your experience. Next up, we have Dr. Elizabeth Walker from Thermo Fisher Scientific to share her experience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Walker, like Amy said, and I'm currently an upstream process development supervisor at Thermo Fisher Scientific. So I'm just going to jump right into what my career path looked like. This is the CV version. So if you check me out on LinkedIn or if you got a copy of my resume, these are all the things you're going to see. So I started out in 2009 pursuing my undergrad at Lindenwood University. I was a biology major with a chemistry minor. I then took a gap year where I worked for the American Red Cross in Cleveland, Ohio, in their blood components lab. So we produced red cells, white cells, all of those things that patients are receiving when they need a blood transfusion. The second half of my gap year, I worked for EMD Millipore in St. Charles, Missouri, where I did ELISA testing for various clinical trial samples. Following that, I transitioned into my graduate degree at St. Louis University, where I received my Ph.D. in biology with an emphasis in cell and molecular regulation. And my area of interest was particularly bacteriology, where I was very involved in ASM and many other organizations like that. I then transitioned into my non-academic postdoc, which is why I'm talking to you all here today, at a small startup company called Bacterioscan here in St. Louis, Missouri. And then finally, I transitioned into my current role as a process development scientist at Thermo Fisher Scientific. So all of that seems very bland. It's pretty much anything you're going to see on any of our CVs. We transition from one thing to another. But similar to Dane's story, there's so much more to that underneath the surface. So if you really started to chat with me, maybe over a drink after work, you would understand there's a lot more to my actual career path than just what my CV shows. So here's the real life version. I grew up in California and I decided, hey, let's try something different. I wanted to end up on the East Coast one day. Shocking, I did not end up on the East Coast. I'm actually in the Midwest still. But I decided, hey, let's try something new. So I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, right outside a suburb called St. Charles, where I attended my undergrad at Lindenwood. I really liked the scholarship they gave me. I didn't want a ton of student loan debt and they were offering something pretty nice. And I said, hey, let's try St. Louis. Let's see what it has to offer. I figured I'm only going to be here 4 years anyways. So even if I don't like it, I'm going to move on later. Well, I ended up loving it, and I fell in love while I was here, and now I'm married to my husband, who at the time was my boyfriend in undergrad. And after undergrad, he moved to Ohio to pursue his career. So that's where I decided, okay, well, I want to follow my fiance, so I guess I'm moving to Ohio. So I took a gap year and moved to Ohio and worked at the Red Cross there. During undergrad, I also thought, oh, I'm going to be pre-med like every other biology major, and I'm going to be a doctor. Well, that didn't happen. I realized halfway through undergrad that I didn't want to be a doctor. It wasn't quite something that fit my personal style. But luckily, I had a really great mentor who taught me about grad school and the fact that it is free, which was also a big benefit for not increasing that student loan debt. And I loved science, so I at least knew, okay, I love science. I'm in at least the right career path roughly. So that's where I went to Ohio and used my undergraduate degree to work at the Red Cross. But after living in Ohio with my fiance for about 8 months, we realized, okay, Ohio's maybe not where we want to be. We didn't have a lot of friends there. It just wasn't fitting the lifestyle we were hoping to create for ourselves. And we had a really great community back in St. Louis. So we decided, okay, let's move back to St. Louis. Let's do it. It's where we had so many friends. My husband is from here. We had a lot of family here, friends, community, just everything we really wanted in life was here. So we transitioned back to St. Louis in 2014. And shortly after we got married, and I started grad school about 3 months after getting married, which I don't recommend. It was a rough first year, but a lot of fun in the same time. So I spent 5 years at St. Louis University pursuing my undergrad, and my department was great. I loved my faculty, but I knew from the experiences I had in my gap year that academia just wasn't for me. I really wanted to go into industry. I loved the stability that that offered, and I wasn't a huge fan of grant writing. So I was like, how can I get away from that as quickly as possible? And graduate school doesn't necessarily prepare you for industry. So I was like, I'm kind of doing this on my own. But my staff, the staff and the faculty were excellent and really helped me to pursue that and giving me the chance to do that, which was really awesome. So in my last year of graduate school, I started networking like crazy. St. Louis, although it's only about 500,000 people, has a really vibrant industry for scientific individuals, scientific-minded individuals. So I started networking really hard, met a person who ended up being my boss at my non-academic postdoc at Bacterioscan. So transitioned there where we worked on a UTI diagnostic. So I got to take my love for bacteria to academia or from academia to industry and really loved it. I chose to do this at this time because at that point I didn't have kids. It was just my husband and I. He had a really stable career. And I was like, if I'm going to work at a startup, now's the chance. Like, let's take the risk. So it was really risk motivated at that point because I had the flexibility to do that. So I started at this company that was only 17 people, where that's kind of a wild ride. You get to do it all, you get to see it all. And I loved that a lot. But after 2 years there, I realized, okay, I'm looking for some more stability in my life. At this point, we were planning on having kids. So I wanted to get into my next career path before we started to actually have those kids so I could kind of have a stable foundation under me. And that's where I transitioned to Thermo Fisher Scientific. Most academics probably know Thermo Fisher for their chemicals or for their lab supplies, but we actually have so much more than that in terms of the organization. So I work for Patheon, which is a subsidiary of Thermo Fisher, and we are the CDMO arm of Thermo Fisher, so producing biologics. So in terms of what my non-academic postdoc looked like, the organization, like I said, was Bacterioscan. It was about 17 people, and my actual title was just postdoc scientist. I actually had that role created for me because at a small organization, they can do what they want. And the man I ended up getting to work for, he was an excellent scientist, still a good friend of mine, and he kind of created the role for me because he was the only scientist in that role in the lab at the time. So it was a very, very small company. And it was, like I said, a UTI diagnostic company. So we got to kind of figure out how do we expand the footprint of this device? How do we help patients in the clinic get diagnosed faster? Antibiotic resistance is always something we were concerned about. I got to kind of be a jack of all trades in this role, which was really fun. Doing all the typical science things, planning and executing experiments. Still had to do a little bit of grant writing at this point. Data analysis, lots of meetings. But it was also a ton of fun, and I was still really involved with ASM at this point because of just the role in general. So I really enjoyed this role because it was my intro into industry and all of the things that that can offer. But then, like I said, I transitioned to a role at a larger company at Thermo Fisher Scientific where there was just a little bit more stability. So I went from a company of 17 individuals to a company that now boasts over 100,000 employees. So very different in terms of just the culture of the company, the benefits they can offer. And that was really enticing for me at that point in my personal life. So like I said, this is technically the arm I work for is Patheon by Thermo Fisher Scientific, and we are a CDMO. So we're a contract development and manufacturing organization, which basically means we have clients come to us and we produce their drugs for them. So my title here is a supervisor of process development. Particularly, I'm in upstream process development, which is the cell line development and cell culture development aspect of that pipeline. So we're using mammalian cell culture to produce those monoclonal antibodies. And I have the privilege of being the cell line development supervisor here, which means we really get to start that project off from scratch for our clients. So kind of get to see the whole gamut from that end. And there are lots of meetings. That's definitely something I don't think you can get away from too easily in industry. But I really enjoy the meetings I get to have because every meeting is very different. So whether I'm talking to a client about their project or I'm talking internally with the team that's helping that project be successful. And as a supervisor, I get to help with career development, which is one of the aspects of my career I love the most. I love getting to be a supervisor and help my employees figure out what they want to do with their careers. I also get to do a lot of mentoring for employees that aren't even reporting to me, and that's a lot of fun. So there's a lot of aspects of my career that I never even imagined going into industry that I really enjoy. But I'm still a scientist at the end of the day, and I am still pretty close to the bench. So the pictures on the bottom here are just some things that we get to work with in our lab. So one of the benefits of industry is the amount of money that is here and the amount of cool things we get to play with. So we have an Amber 250, which is basically a fancy robot that has a bunch of bioreactors in it. And we get to run our experiments on this, testing different culture processes and what we can do to help optimize these processes. So at the end of the day, we're really looking at creating more drugs in a quicker amount of time. And that's something that we're always trying to help our clients with. And then the picture of the 3 bioreactors off to the left-hand side, those are some of the Thermo Fisher bioreactors. The scale is not great, but the bioreactor on the right-hand side is actually 5,000 liter bioreactor. It's single use, meaning it is used once for every client process, and it is 5,000 liters. So it's about 2 stories tall in reality, and it's pretty crazy to see that that's how drugs that are ending up in the clinic are manufactured. I had no idea what that looked like until I started here, and getting to see that whole process is truly just mind-blowing. So some key takeaways from my career, that was a lot packed into just a few slides, but I hope that you realize that a career is more than a job. It's part of a whole life. So I hope you create a career that you enjoy, and that is part of your holistic life. Also, developing a strong network is super important. I would not have gotten my postdoc if I didn't talk to people. I told that postdoc wasn't even a thing until I talked to somebody. So don't be afraid to talk to people. Understanding their stories is super important and can help you tailor yours to just be the life you want to create for yourself. And lastly, have a plan and prepare, but be willing to change. Hopefully, we all learned that from the pandemic. But being able to be prepared will allow you to pivot even quicker when something comes along and maybe changes your plans or you change your mind. And all of those things are okay. So I hope that you got something from this, and I'm happy to reach out on LinkedIn. Similar to Dane, just let me know that you saw me at ASM, and I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing your story. I really appreciate you discussing how important your network was and that you and that network were part of creating that postdoc position for yourself. And I have no doubt that we'll get some terrific questions at the end of all these presentations specific for you. Our next presenter is Dr. Jaspreet Mand, the senior scientist at LysisLogic Scientific Inc., and we cannot wait to hear about her career path.
Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Jaspreet Mand. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm excited to share my career path so far. I've listed my LinkedIn here at the very front, so yes, feel free to connect and just let me know that this is where you've gotten my information from. So I thought I would take you through my journey in life so far. So I grew up in Canada, in Calgary, Alberta, and I stayed there for all of my schooling, including my grad school. and which I finished in 2016. At that point, I actually moved down to Houston, Texas in the US to do my industrial postdoc, and I'll go into more detail on that in a little bit. And then I stayed there for, I guess, my first real job, if you will, also in Houston. After that, and after the pandemic, I made quite a big move and I moved overseas to the UK, and I spent a couple of years living in the UK, which was a great experience. And then I just recently moved back to Canada, though to a different city, Winnipeg, which is in the prairies. And I just moved there this year, but I'll go into what my current position is as well. So as I mentioned, from 2000, well, I've got from birth, but 2008 to 2016 is when I did all of my schooling. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and it's known for the mountains. It's a beautiful place to live. I did my bachelor's there in cellular, molecular, and microbial biology. I have to note, though, that I didn't actually start off as a biologist. When I first went to the U of C, I thought that I wanted to be a mathematician, so I was actually in math, and then at some point along the way, I took a couple of microbiology courses. I met a really great professor, and I asked him if I could do some research in his lab. And so in my third year, I did a 1 semester long research project and loved it. And so then in my fourth year, I asked him if I could do a longer one, and I did an entire year-long research project in my undergrad. And I've got the title of it here. It was about microbial iron corrosion by anaerobic microorganisms. And again, I loved it. It was such a great experience. And so when I graduated in June of 2012 with this BSc degree, I actually asked this professor if I could maybe do grad school in his lab. And so I also did my PhD from the same institution. It was the University of Calgary, and I got a PhD in environmental microbiology. And again, my dissertation was in microbial ecology of carbon steel corrosion. And so after doing all of that school in the same place, I thought I would mention all the key skills that I learned. I know that for some people, they'll do a PhD, and when they actually move on to their postdoc or to whatever job they choose afterwards, sometimes you don't actually end up doing exactly what your PhD was on. But for my case, it's actually very different and I think a little bit unique. Because both my bachelor's and my PhD research was on microbial corrosion of steel, the skills that I gained in anaerobic microbiology and petroleum microbiology in particular were extremely applicable to my postdoc afterwards. During my PhD, it was really, looking back, it was really great that I learned how to approach applied research there as well, because I think that's really important if you're planning on doing a career in industry. Instead of looking at research from just a fundamental research point of view, looking at how you can actually apply this to solve real world challenges is important. During my time at the U of C, I also really got a lot of experience and learned how to discuss research needs with industry. And this was through workshops that were held annually and through a lot of conference attending. And it was actually through conference attendance that I learned about and eventually met who would become my postdoc supervisor. So the last key skill that I've listed here is networking. And I think Elizabeth did a really good job of stressing how important that is. And I'm going to do the same. So it was actually during my PhD in the last year where I went to a conference and I met this guy who I thought was a great scientist and he was doing cool research. We got to talking, and then as soon as I got back, he had messaged and said, "Hey, I'm actually looking for a postdoc. Do you think you might be interested in applying?" And so when I graduated with my PhD in 2016 and 2017, I actually ended up moving to ExxonMobil Upstream Research Company. So this is a multinational, international energy company, and it's located in Houston, Texas. So I actually moved down to Texas for that. It was an industrial postdoc, and so I had a research topic that I was researching during that time. It was about how commonly used oil field chemicals impact the localized nature of biofilm formation on pipelines. So you can tell just from similar words that I've used, that I was still on microbial corrosion, it was still on biofilms, I was talking about anaerobic microbiology. So many of the skills that I learned during my PhD were directly applicable to this postdoc. And then the key learnings I listed here, one of them was really just moving to a new country. Up until this point, I had spent my entire life in Calgary. And so moving to a new city where I didn't know anyone and having to make new friends and find a new grocery store and navigating a new city, those were all new experiences that I know that I grew a lot from. And so that was good, and definitely key learning throughout my postdoc. Because ExxonMobil is an energy company, I actually learned a lot about engineering during this postdoc time. So I came into it as a microbiologist, but almost everyone else on my team was some form of engineer. And while I was a postdoc, I actually got to take trainings on very specific types of engineering, like production engineering and corrosion and materials engineering. And this is really important because I think one of the biggest takeaways or learnings that I had from my postdoc was how multidisciplinary all industrial problems are, and how multidisciplinary topics actually influence microbiology out there in industry. And what I mean by this is, instead of just looking at the specific microbes that I was interested in and the ones that I wanted to research, the ones that I found fascinating, I also had to take into account in my research how chemistry affected their growth and different flow properties and different materials that were chosen by people. I learned a lot about how economics takes or plays a role in microbiology practices. I learned a lot about different regulatory landscapes because it was a international company. We worked in lots of different parts of the world. And so I got to learn about different regulatory landscapes in many different countries and understand how those influence the microbiology that I was looking at. And I also learned a lot about how human behaviors can influence the microbiology that you're researching. So it was a really cool and interesting postdoc. When I originally signed up for it, it was supposed to be a 2-year long postdoc. But after about a year and a half, they actually offered me a full-time position in the same group that I was doing my postdoc in, and I accepted. And so for the next 4-ish years, I was a senior research engineer in the same company, ExxonMobil Upstream Research Company, located also in Houston, Texas. At this point, my job duties did change a little bit. I was called a research engineer, so I was definitely still doing a lot of research. However, the nature of it had changed a little bit. When I was doing my industrial postdoc, I think I spent maybe 4 days a week in the lab in a very cool outfitted industrial microbiology lab. And then I would spend about 1 day a week in the office. Over the 4 years that I spent as a senior research engineer, it had pretty much completely flipped, and I was only spending about 1 day per week in the lab and then 4 days per week in the office. I did have a research project. This time I was developing innovative proteomic and genomic microbial monitoring technologies based on biomarkers that we could use to detect harmful microbial growth in the field. So I did have a research project, but then a part of my job was something called research application. And this was where we would consult with different business units across the globe as a microbiology expert and provide advice and guidance. So it was still a lot of applied microbiology, but it wasn't necessarily microbial research. It was a lot of there's a problem and what kinds of microbial solutions or what kind of solutions can we find in the lab to deal with that problem and actually go ahead and apply them in the field. In terms of a job environment, as I mentioned, my job was a mixture of office and lab settings, but it did involve a lot of really cool field trips out to the field. So I've got some pictures here of different times when I got to go out to the field and actually do some microbiology in the field. And I think that was one of the coolest parts of this job because you get to do applied microbiology and then actually go out and see the impact that you're making in the field. You actually get to look at a real big pipeline and see where the microbes might be growing in it and talk with people out there. It was an experience from which I learned a lot and one of the coolest parts of the job, I would say. In terms of key skills that I learned, in this role, I think the biggest things I learned was all about project management, technical leadership, and how to mentor junior technicians and field technicians. I also learned how to lead really, really large multidisciplinary projects. So for the research project where I was trying to develop new microbial monitoring technologies, our team was comprised of a few microbiologists in Houston, but we were working with people located across the globe in different business units, sometimes working in the field, sometimes managing different people. So learning how to actually manage projects across all these different spaces was a really great skill that I learned. I also learned about clear, concise communication with experts and non-experts. And in the research application work that I did, I really learned how to provide fit-for-service solutions. So sometimes you might want to come up with the fanciest microbiology technique, and it would be cool and it might solve the problem, but you always have to keep in the back of your mind, well, can they actually do it in this remote part of the world where they're located? Is it actually a solution that they can actually apply right away and get useful information from? And so learning how to make judgment calls on that was an important skill I learned as well. And then in 2022, I made quite a big decision, and that was to move across the world to the UK. And that was really because of the pandemic. So the pandemic was long and hard for all of us. And I was in a long distance relationship for 5 years during that pandemic. And at some point, I just decided it's too much. I can't do it anymore. And so I made the move to the UK where my partner was living at the time. And I got a new job at the National Biofilms Innovation Center located in Southampton. This is a really cool research center where they do interdisciplinary research and industrial partnerships to advance biofilm science and technology. My role there was as program manager. This time the working environment was really different. There was no lab, there was no field component, and it was actually just a hybrid position. So I got to work from home most of the time, and I would go in about once a week to meet with a team. Job duties that I had at this institution were to develop a training program for PhD researchers across multiple different universities. And the idea was that because I had experience doing microbiology in industry, I would then use that experience to develop a training program so that future PhD researchers could actually gain the skills and knowledge that they would need in order to be successful in industrial positions later on. In this job, I identified collaborations between academia and industry and put the two in contact with each other. And this was mostly for a grant competition that I was managing called the Collaborative Trainings Partnership. So it was a really great team. There's a picture of all of them there. In terms of key skills that I learned in this job, there was a lot of partnership building because we were trying to work between academia and industry and trying to match people up in terms of skills and objectives and knowledge. So a lot of partnership building. I used my knowledge of industrial research to train future PhD students. And then a lot of project development and implementation because this training program I was just starting up when I joined the team. And so it was a lot of coming up with ideas and seeing what would work and actually implementing it and getting it out there in the UK. Also in 2023, I took on a role as an independent contractor. And so that's something that you can also do if you're considering industrial microbiology. This is really cool. Like, as I mentioned, I was living in the UK and my role with the National Biofilms Innovation Center was hybrid. And so I was based in the UK, which is a lovely, lovely place to live. So here are some great pictures of the UK. But I got to just live in Oxford and compile and review sector knowledge to identify environmental biotechnology research opportunities for clean energy applications. So topics I looked at were underground hydrogen storage and carbon capture and sequestration and looking at how microbiology influences those kinds of topics. So I did that on the side when I was in the UK. And then we get to this year. So earlier this year, I again moved back to Canada. And again, it was a choice that wasn't necessarily dictated by my career. It was because my partner got a job here in Winnipeg, and I wanted to move. And so now I'm a senior scientist at a startup called LysisLogic Scientific, and I work remotely from Winnipeg, Manitoba. The company is located in Calgary, so it's not far. I do go for project meetings, but most of my days are spent by myself here in Winnipeg. And this is a startup that's focused on research innovation needed for the energy transition. So I'm looking at how microorganisms can be used to fuel the energy transition and for a low emissions future, and then providing my industrial microbiology expertise to different stakeholders that the company has. Skills that I've gained in this job so far, one of the most important is probably working independently, because it's a small startup, and because I'm working remotely, it is a lot of independent work. But also at the same time working in a multidisciplinary team, because everyone else that I'm working with isn't a microbiologist. And so trying to communicate what I'm doing and why it's important to people without that prior background knowledge is a skill that I think I'm gaining right now. And then commercializing research opportunities, which is something I had previous experience with both at ExxonMobil and at the National Biofilms Innovation Center, but I'm putting it into practice more here at LysisLogic. I think that's all I've got today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I think something that we can all appreciate is you discussing the skills that you gained. I think something we don't realize is when we apply for positions, we may not be experts in everything that they need, and those are opportunities for growth. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to populate our Q&A before we start asking our audience questions. Something I would love to ask all of our speakers is if you could describe something that you really enjoy about your positions and something that you find very challenging in your current positions. And you all can go however order you'd like.
I can jump in first. So one thing I think I kind of alluded to in my presentation that I really love is the people leading aspect of my job. I don't think that's something that academia taught me about at all. And so I really came in being like, how do I lead people well? But luckily, the organization I work for does a really great job training people. And I think that's the most rewarding piece, like getting to see like the employees that I get to train. And I'm sure like PIs probably feel the same way when they see their PhDs graduate and move on and do things like that. But that's like the industry version is like getting to train people and help them like grow in their career. That's really rewarding, and seeing people grow is awesome. The most challenging, I think COVID changed everything for industry, especially biologics. So when I started in 2021, we were a year into the pandemic, and everybody thought monoclonal antibodies were going to be the solution to this pandemic. So it was just like, how can we make timelines faster? How can we make drugs quicker? And so I think for a company that's like a CDMO that I'm at, nothing will ever be the same. The biologics industry just moves so fast. And so really making sure that I can maintain a healthy work-life balance for myself in an industry that is not slowing down anytime soon.
I can go next. So something I really enjoy, I really talk about the three pillars of what I do enjoy, but I do want to say the people I work with are really great. That's why I chose my office and why I got placed where I was placed. And getting to see what's kind of behind the black box of government and how, quote unquote, the sausage is made. And I think when you're on the outside, you have a certain impression of what government is like is it like Parks and Rec or something? And then you see it, and it kind of is, yeah, it's kind of like that. But it is like, a nice way to get insight into everything that's going on and all the great work that people are doing, honestly. And you get an appreciation for that. Challenges, sometimes people can be difficult to work with. And that can make things frustratingly slow in government. And I mean, you talk about bureaucracy. We've got it in spades. And also, you can be in an advisory role and give like scientific inputs, but that is not the be all and end all of what goes into decision making for policies. So unless you are in a decision making position, I am not. I'm a contractor, a lowly peon, a shrimp in the sea. Unless you're in those positions, you're not going to be the ones making that call. And you can choose to be in those positions. It's just you got to really climb and work to get there.
Thank you, Dane.
For myself, I think that the part of my job that I really like the most is working with cool people, like all the big ideas that they have, all the cool ideas that they have, and that it's always ideas that are going to change the world. It's what we're always working towards, and I love that kind of thinking. It's really, yeah, big ideas. It's not like little tiny incremental changes that we're ever looking at. So that's probably the coolest part of my job, is getting to work with these kind of people. In terms of challenges, I'd say both in the job that I'm in now and then also the job that I had at ExxonMobil, it's that microbiology is just like one tiny part of the whole puzzle. There's so much else that's going on around you. And so trying to convince people that, yes, it's important, it's something that you should keep into account when you're doing your assessments or calculations or whatever. So just trying to communicate that it is important and how it can affect the big picture of things, I'd say is probably the most challenging.
Thank you, guys. We have some really great audience questions that I'm going to read, and any of you can jump into. One is, what will be the impact of publication in getting a non-academic postdoc? And how do you focus? What skills in my CV should I focus on if it's not publication?
I can go ahead and go first. So you remember how I said, like, I didn't quite fit the mold of what I thought, the scientist should be? You can tell by my quirky personality, it's like that. But also, I had 0 first author publications going into my fellowship. And that was just because my thesis project kept yielding negative result after negative result, which is amazing. And so I would say that it's not a limiting factor when it comes to policy fellowships, as long as you can show that scientific acumen, show to people that you understand the work that you're doing and that you have those analytical skills that you can apply in the government world. That being said, it sure helps, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've applied to jobs recently and they're like, oh, list your publication. Okay, yeah, well. So.
For myself, my postdoc was very much a research-based postdoc, and so I think publications did matter. One thing that I would actually say to look out for if you are going to be doing an industrial postdoc, and something that I appreciated that my PI did, was even if it was an industrial postdoc, we had a plan that these are the things that we are looking to publish, so that there will be some sort of record of you doing research here, just in case after your industrial postdoc, you decide industry isn't for me and you do want to go back to academia. So that was something that I really appreciate that my PI and I talked about right from the very beginning, that it is an industrial postdoc, but we are going to work on publications just in case you want to go back into a traditional academic career path.
Something I'd like to mention with what you're saying is you can go back and forth. And there are quite a few academics who bring a wealth of knowledge from industry into an institution. And sometimes academia institutions are actually looking for folks who have those experiences, because now you know how to train undergraduates, graduates, or postdocs for those types of positions in the future, which are terrific as well. So for folks that are joining us, if you do an industrial postdoc, that doesn't mean that you can exclude academia forever. You can go back and forth for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think I fall, oh, I'm sorry, Amy. I fall
Please.
somewhere in the middle of Dane and Jaspreet, where I had one publication and I did not care to publish at all. And I told my PA that from the beginning in graduate school. My postdoc didn't necessarily care about publishing, although we attempted to a few times. But my current role, like, nobody has ever asked about my publications. So in a CV, like, they don't also talk about a CV, like they talk about a resume, and there's not really room on a resume for publications most of the time. So it's really about putting those skill sets that you've learned on your resume and highlighting those things, at least in my experience.
This is a great question. All of you mentioned networking and how important it was for your career paths. And so it would be great if you all could give a tip or two on the best ways to network. And then if you noticed any particular ways that you networked, if that led to real opportunities or lasting relationships compared to other methods of networking.
I can go. So I have a very successful friend at Department of State who insists, she says something along the lines of, you don't have to do anything if you try hard enough when it comes to networking. She hates networking. And I personally hate networking in the kind of schmoozy transactional sense. I really like forming a meaningful relationship with someone and getting to know them. That being said, the policy world can sometimes feel very small, and relationships are absolutely crucial for getting any work done. The distinction between significant lasting networking relationships and those that don't is actually not really clear. You could be great friends with someone, really get to know them and never cross paths in the policy world, or you could just barely meet someone at a happy hour or a mixer, and then they could help you get a job offer just from that little interaction. So the real lesson is, don't burn bridges. You can always ford the river, take an underground tunnel if you don't like the bridge, or you think that you may not have nurtured the bridge, but you never know when that bridge might turn into like a major thoroughfare or even circle back to you unexpectedly.
I think that's really such good advice. Don't burn bridges, because you never know when the networks are going to come back and help you out. The examples I have is actually the National Biofilm Innovation Center job that I got. They had invited someone in my group to give a presentation at a workshop a few years before the pandemic. And then when I made the decision that's it, I quit, I'm moving to the UK, I was like, well, I mean, I guess I have this person on LinkedIn, so I'll reach out. And it worked out. And then with LysisLogic, it's a company based in Calgary, and I knew some of the people from the University of Calgary when I was there, 7-8 years ago. And it was really just like, oh, let's reach out, let's just chat, see what happens. And they had a job available this year. And so you never know when the network could help you. So just keep everyone in mind. There's no special way that you can be like, oh, this is going to lead me to a job. It might come back in 5-10 years from now.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you said. I think it's really important to, one, not burn bridges for sure. And most biotech industries are pretty small once you get into them. So you never know who you can reach out to in the future to gain knowledge, to maybe make a recommendation. For me, I think one of my best tips was I did a lot of informational interviews in grad school, trying to figure out like, what the heck do I want to do when I'm done? Because at that point I knew I wanted to go into industry, but I didn't know what that even looked like. I was the first generation college student, and so I had no idea that anything but med school was an option. So at that point, trying to kind of figure it out was all on my own. And I did a lot of networking where I just had coffee with people. And at the end of that meeting, if I felt like it went well, I would ask them, hey, based on our conversation, is there 1 or 2 people in your network that you think I should talk to? And then those connections just made connection after connection. And I think I probably spoke to 4 or 5 people, and like it was a tree at this point. Like I literally kept like a diagram of like, okay, I met this person, they introduced me to these 2 people, they introduced me to these 2 people. And so I just started to create this like tree of people I knew and what I learned from each one of them. And finally, like 5 people down one of these trees, I met the person who gave me my academic or my industry postdoc. So you just really never know who's going to be that person that leads you to the next position.
I love that tree, because I think that's a great way for all of us to consider how we want to organize our networking, right? And who you meet, and making notes so you can remember when you want to come back to that. Thank you all. Someone asked, what are your tips for industry interviews? Anything around either CV, prep, anything that you would like to share that you think would help folks that are interested in similar career paths?
I think for me, if you haven't started following The Cheeky Scientist, that was my kind of like foray into understanding what industry looks like and like how to tailor my things. That's just a jumping off point that I used, but there's all kinds of great books out there, recommendations for how to write a good resume. It's very much, at least in my industry, like resume oriented versus CV. So like, how do you get, most of us have pretty in-depth careers. How do you get all of that on a 1 to 2 page document? And how do you get that through, if you're doing like the traditional path of submitting a resume to an online portal, how do you get it past that first portal that's really pretty much AI at that point? And then how do you get that in the hands of the HR rep? And then how does that get into the hands of the hiring manager? So if you go that traditional path, like understanding what that looks like and how to navigate it, and then also that network, because a network can help you bypass those hurdles of all of those systems. If you have a network of somebody that can get you directly to the hiring manager, they can pull your resume through faster than having to go through all those steps. So just understanding what that looks like is really important.
One tip that I would give, and something that I used, is when my postdoc but the industrial postdoc posting was actually posted on a career website, just like any other job. And I actually did take that to, I think it was called Career Services at the university. And they actually did help me tailor my, I did use a CV to apply at that point, but they helped me tailor that in the cover letter. And that was the first time I had ever done it for a real professional position. And so that was actually a really big help. And I would encourage anyone to look for those kind of resources. As a student, you probably get them for free. So make use of them.
When it comes to the policy world, I started my own student policy organization at my institute, but there are already a lot of chapters that exist. The National Science Policy Network is just like, it's in the US mostly, but it has a bunch of collections of those student-run, postdoc-run organizations. That's a great way to get involved. Go to meetings like the AAAS meeting. They've got science, but there's a heavy emphasis on policy. And I think you can even find them probably, like if you go to like an ASM meeting, right? There's probably some small webinars or seminars that are focused on policy. Other ways you can get involved. Honestly, you can get involved in local government. You can get local, if you're near a state capital, you can get involved there too. They're always looking for help. Let me tell you, the government is always running like on a, like barely, like everybody's holding it up. So they can always use, help where they can. That being said, let me just give this advice. Do not think you're going to go in and just like, yeah, I've got all the answers and I'm going to use all the data and like, yeah, you're going to be like, woo. No, that's not how it's going to work. No, don't expect that.
That's terrific information to know. We have a couple of questions around, do we actually need to do a postdoc to get into the types of companies and positions that you are in? And so if anyone wants to take that away.
I'm going to say something that's probably pretty controversial in this setting. You don't need a postdoc, at least in my field. And something even more controversial, you probably don't even need a PhD. Most of the people at my level have a master's or knew they wanted to go in an industry much earlier than I did. So they started there. I think that sometimes can frustrate PhDs. I know it frustrated me for a minute. But what I realized is that I learned different things. So I bring a different skill set than those people who maybe went in straight to industry. So it's not bad, it's just different. But there are just different paths to get to the same place.
I think it really depends on what you want to do in industry. Like a job in industry isn't just one thing. I think that for my industrial postdoc and then the job I got right after that, it was really research based. And so having a PhD and an industrial postdoc helped me with that for sure. But there are definitely a lot of other jobs, especially in a company as big as ExxonMobil, where you don't need a PhD to get in at all. And so it really depends on what you're looking at.
So if you're thinking of postdoc in terms of like an academic postdoc, no, you don't need to do one to go into the policy world. You can hop straight through, actually straight out of grad school into policy. If you're really good, you can apply for jobs in government directly. You can apply at pharmaceutical companies in their government affairs office, their regulatory office, compliance office. You can work in med writing. So like you can go that way. That being said, it can sort of dictate sort of ceilings in a way. It depends. It really depends. But having a postdoc, an academic postdoc, or having a fellowship can really help. Even there are PIs who go into our fellowship programs, and that can really dictate where they'll be wanted and where they'll go.
Thank you. We have a really interesting question here, which is, what would you gain from a non-academic postdoc compared to an academic postdoc?
I think one of the things that I learned was how to work independently, even more so than I think you would in an academic postdoc. And the reason I say this is because I was the only postdoc in the company that I was at the time. And when I first got hired, I think there was 2 other people working in the area of microbiology. So when it came to testing out new techniques or finding something out, there really wasn't that many people around you to talk to who understood what you were working on in terms of research. And so learning how to get that information for yourself and Being a lot more independent was something I think I learned, whereas I think if you're in a university setting traditionally, if you're learning to use a new microscope, there's probably someone in another lab that's used it before and can probably train you on it, and you don't necessarily need to do it all by yourself when you're learning new techniques and stuff like that.
For me, I can't speak to an academic postdoc. I didn't do one. I don't have many network people who did, honestly. But I would say what I learned from my industry postdoc that I think was huge was I was already like, I knew I wanted to go into industry. Like that was my long-term career. I didn't see myself pivoting back to academia. So in that sense, it was jumping straight in and learning what does industry have to offer and how do I function in that space. So in that sense, it was really useful for me.
Like Elizabeth, I also did not do a traditional postdoc, so I can't really say, but I kind of guess that you probably won't be working with like the kind of data that you would in government. So you have to get really accustomed and comfortable with working with awful data sets and working with incomplete data and having to turn around things quickly. Like someone says, like from, the secretary wants you to like write up a briefing or a talking point, and you've got 1 hour to do it and be the expert on it, but you're like, yeah, I think you just really learn to be comfortable with a lot of incomplete data and partial analyses, which is unfortunate, but it's just the reality of the policy world.
Thank you. We have a really interesting question about somebody who would like to work internationally, and would like to know if there are international opportunities for these types of postdocs or just these types of work opportunities in general.
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned that there are policy opportunities for international trainees in the US, but there are also fellowship opportunities in other foreign governments. So you just have to kind of do a little bit of Google Food, but there is that document that I had in my slide. I can put it in the chat that should list some of them. I don't know if it's been updated.
All I have to say is yes, definitely. There's international opportunities out there. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on how, I know you were looking in particular arenas because of where your life was at, but do you have any recommendations on how one would look for these types of opportunities?
I mean, I guess for me, even if I was looking at specific places, the people that I was talking with was all people that I met at international conferences. So do your best during your graduate studies to get out there and go to conferences and meet people. It's probably the best advice I can give.
Thank you. We have another individual who has some gap years on their resume, and is really interested in trying industry or non-academic postdoc. And I was looking for some advice on how they can discuss this in their resume based on the different types of careers you all have. Do you have any recommendations?
So as somebody who's reviewed resumes for hiring, for me, it's not a problem as long as like once we have a conversation, you can give me a rationale. Like I showed in my own personal life, things happen. You don't always take a linear trajectory. And so I don't expect everybody to never have not had any gap that they can't explain. So for me, it's just, can you explain it? And what did you learn in that time? Because you weren't doing nothing, so you were probably learning something. So what skill did you learn from that time that you can still apply to whatever position you're looking for?
I agree. I've also been involved in recruiting, both in the US and the UK, and I would say just be honest about it. I think people are understanding and it's not weird or abnormal. I think lots of people have gaps, so it's fine.
So I kind of have a contrary point to that. You might remember, I burned out and I was like severely depressed for almost 2 years, which is kind of crazy. And you can't exactly put that on a resume, or people don't respond well to that. And I've just kind of glossed over it because I have so many other experiences that it just makes up for it. But I personally, if I'm in a position where I'm reviewing applications, I 100% do not hold it against someone. for sure.
I'm in a similar boat where I think if it's explained in the cover letter in some arena, I don't need details, but so much life happens. And I think we all recognize, and hiring committees know, and HR folks know, human resource folks know that life happens. Which has been, oh, hold on a second. I'm sorry. I misread that. Let's see here. Do any of you know of funding opportunities for students who are admitted into U.S. institutions, but are not permanent residents, like funded industrial postdocs or non-academic postdocs, I should say?
I'm not sure if this is helpful, but when I was a Canadian living in Canada, when I applied for my industrial postdoc, and they just sorted out a visa, like it was part of, we want you, we want to hire you. And so the visa was applied for as part of the job. So don't let it stop you. There's definitely companies out there that if they're willing to hire you, they'll sponsor a visa for you.
So I didn't cover a lot about like payment and stipends for fellowships, but most of them they do have stipends of some sort. For instance, I know the Mirzayan Fellowship through National Academies, they offer a very small stipend, but it's like a 3-month period. And you can do this simultaneously while you are in grad school or doing a postdoc, if your PI allows it. And I'll also say that the salaries can range. So if you become a congressional fellow, it really depends on which society is funding you and how much. I'm sure ASM has a fellow in Congress, and I don't know how much they get paid, but it ranges wildly. And for the executive branch, it'll depend. So if you come straight out of grad school, I was getting about 85 to 90K 3-4 years ago. And if you're a postdoc, it goes up a little bit more. And if you're a PI and so on, it'll go up more depending on that. There is a little bit of a ceiling there.
We have a really interesting question. Where do you see your industries going in the future?
I kind of alluded to that one earlier. Biologics industry has just gotten crazier since COVID. It's not slowing down. Our clients are coming to us. How can we make timelines quicker? If you know anything about the biologics industry, most molecules fail. So those companies want to know sooner that they're going to fail. So they're trying to get to first in human to the clinic as quick as possible. So timelines are key. And biologics is only expected to grow by billions of dollars. I think the stat is something like $250 billion in the next like 5 years. So biologics is only getting bigger.
Similar for me, I'm working with LysisLogic in the green energy space and sustainable energy for the future. Everyone's interested in it. I think it's only going to grow.
As you might be well aware, the government is wild, and you have no idea who will assume power and what that's going to mean for your agency. For instance, there was that recent Supreme Court Chevron ruling. They basically overturned an old decision. And that can have huge ramifications if you're in a regulatory office. I'm in a policy office, so it doesn't really affect me. But, like I said, it can vary wildly. And, that's why you kind of also keep your options open when it comes to looking for jobs. Don't stop. Don't stop looking.
Do you all have recommendations on job boards, listservs, or places that folks should look if they want a position similar to yours or an industrial postdoc?
Well, I mean, I put that Google Doc there for the fellowships for policy. Like I said, there are other routes into the policy world. I will also say that there are resources available, but a lot of these, so there's like a blue book, I think, for Congress where you can get like staffer positions. There's all sorts of resources, but they're kind of hidden and tucked away. But when you do get into a fellowship, it provides a really great network. So like I get career job postings all the time on my through the listserv, and it's really great.
Yeah, I think nothing beats going direct. If there's a company you're interested in or a very particular job you're interested in, going to that company's website and seeing what's available. Oftentimes, you can set up alerts on a lot of these websites, whether it's the company page or something like LinkedIn or Indeed, where you can set up notifications and have them sent directly to your email that these types of job postings are available with various keywords. So I agree with Dane, never stop looking. You never know what's going to happen. And so I personally still get emails just letting me know what's out there in the job market at any given time.
Yeah, I don't have any specific site to recommend, but I do see postings on LinkedIn all the time. So just keep an eye out.
Thank you, guys. Are there any particular skills or skill sets that you are seeing that are more prominent either in job ads or as being part of hiring committees that you're looking for?
I mean, I can tell you right now that big data was big and it is still continuing to be big. So if you are one of those people who's so inclined and like loves R and all that stuff, there's always demand for that. And yeah.
Yeah, I would echo that for Dane. I'm not one of those people who is inclined for big data sets. So I sometimes I feel like I maybe write myself off in that instance, but everybody has something to offer. So for me, being a scientist who actually has a love for people leading and those skills, so I can really bring my what I bring to the table is people leading and science in one, where somebody else in my position may have that ability to love those big data sets, and I still need their help. So at the end of the day, we're a team. You're not just functioning in a silo. I think sometimes that's kind of how it was in academia, where it was like you're the program manager for this little project that you're working on to write your dissertation. I think somebody said it earlier of like you're in a big community once you go into a career like this. You're on a big team with lots of people who have different skill sets. So if you don't love big data, you're okay. But if you do love it, it's huge right now.
I'm thinking back to when I worked at the National Biofilm Innovation Center, and it was a lot of recruiting of PhD researchers. Things that we were looking for was an interest in multidisciplinary points of view, when especially even as a PhD researcher, willing to learn from different people at different universities and put that together in your research. And I would say willingness to learn good science communication was also really big through whether it be through like your publications and conference presentations, but also public engagement and activities like that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo really quickly that I had no experience in science, STEM workforce or STEM education policy. So being able to adapt and learn those things quickly, it's things outside your field is really important in my world.
I think that's something we should echo. There's a lot of questions around I'm a medical microbiologist, or I don't have bioinformatics skills. Can I still get a job like yours? And so I guess to wrap up, what would be your piece of advice for a graduate student or a postdoc that is interested in entering into your fields that doesn't fit the mold of the job description perfectly?
You're never going to fit the job description perfectly. So if you're waiting for that 90, 100%, you're never going to get there. It is really a wish list in my experience from what the hiring manager would dream of for the perfect employee, and you're rarely going to reach that. If you meet at least 50 or 60%, apply and figure out how you can use your skills to write it so that it's a transferable skill to the thing they're looking for. At the end of the day, they want somebody who is flexible and who can learn these things quickly. And as a PhD, you 100% have that skill.
Yeah, I think that's important. That sometimes maybe as a PhD student, you might be focused on the specific technical skills that you've gained or the techniques that you've done for your research, but you've actually learned a whole lot of stuff around that. And make sure you show that to the person that you're trying to impress, that actually I'm really, really great at science communication. Look at all these different things that I've done. Bring those transferable skills into your application.
Yes, so I'll reiterate that. And when you're applying for fellowships, we're really looking for I have not actually been on a committee, but I've spoken to people on those committees. And I've been in an office that was taking fellows, and we are looking for red flags, basically. So we don't want you saying like, oh, I'm just running away from academia. Like, don't say that. Say why you want to come to policy, right? Like what interests you, what draws you to it. And, we don't want people who also have like that ego, right? That is like, I'm going to change the world and you're all wrong. We don't want that. So it's really not about fitting a mold so much as like a willingness to be open to new things, new ideas, and learning. And then the other thing I'll say is there really isn't a mold too for just in general for policy, because we need everyone. Like, we talk about diversity matters. It really matters. Like we need someone who does microbial work. We need somebody who does seismology. Like all of that matters and is important.
This was awesome. Thank you all for sharing your career trajectories. I think some major takeaways is how important it is to network, to be doing some informational interviews right now, to really make the time for career exploration. If you are a postdoc or a graduate student, I mean, these are only 3 individuals with very different careers, but there's so many more out there and everyone has these different pathways. You all showed us it's not a linear progression, right? We're going different places and things are happening both in the world and in our personal lives. And that it's just really important to be able to adapt as we continue on with our careers. So thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Shilpa, for putting this together and inviting us. And thank you to our audience for these wonderful questions. We really appreciate everyone's time and effort in this.